Okay. All right. Okay. Now it's recording.
Okay. All right. So here we are. We're going to start.
Screen.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you for being here. This is a webinar with the Maison Dora, Maar. Carla was here in 2008, one of our first artists here. And I have known Carla for quite a long time. In fact, I remember the first time was a project that you did back when I was working at SCAD and Lacoste. And you needed a bunch of eggs, I think. You remember? We had to get a whole bunch of white eggs. You did this beautiful, she was doing this beautiful installation, the sound installation in a cave here using eggs with lights, LED lights, and you would move the eggs around and it made different music. And it was just an amazing installation. But complicated because you can't find white eggs in France.
Yeah, so I actually brought them in my luggage. I actually brought 100 white eggshells in my luggage. That's
right.
The height of the avian flu.
Yeah, that was funny. So Carla has, when we started the Dora Maar residency, she was one of the first artists that came here and artist designers. And we stayed friends. And so it was really exciting for me to be able to ask her to do this when I saw that she had her book, My Robot Gets Me, How Social Design Can Make New Products More Human. So Carla, I'm just going to read Carla's bio because it's impressive. She's a designer, an author, an educator who explores the impact of future technologies through hands-on experiments in product design and tangible interaction. She's designed a range of products from robots to connected home appliances, and her work has appeared on the covers of Popular Science, Technology Review, and the New York Times Sunday Review. Carla has been granted the honor of creating the 4D design program at the Cranbrook Academy of Art, serving as its first designer in residence. And you began accepting students in the fall of 2019. She also serves as the head of design of Diligent Robotics and is an ongoing collaborator with the Socially Intelligent Machines Lab at the University of Texas in Austin, where advances in artificial intelligence and machine learning manifest in expressive robots. Carla writes and lectures frequently on the social impact of robots and emerging technologies, and created the world's first children's book on 3D design, Leo the Maker Prince, which I have copies of. She co-hosts RoboPsych podcast. I didn't know that. That was
I got a podcast.
And a bi-weekly discussion around design and psychological impact of human-robot interaction. Her latest book, My Robot Gets Me, How Social Design Can Make New Products More Human, was published by the Harvard Business Review Press and is out and is available for everyone to order. And I will make sure in the email that we send out tomorrow that there's a link to where you can order the book. Carla's going to do a presentation, and afterwards, please feel free to write in the chat box questions that you might have. So take it away, Carla. I'm so pleased to have you talk with you. See you again.
Yes, cool. Well, thank you for having me. I have such fond memories and great love for my experience at Dora Maar House. So I'm going to share my screen and have a presentation here. Gwen's already told.
It's still the one. It's the one you have to do it where it's only once. There you go.
Okay, thank you. All right, there we go. So Gwen's already told you all a little bit about my background. Really, I have a practice that is both as a designer as well as an artist. A lot of my art practice allows me to get my hands on things that I'm really curious about. And I work in electronics and with emerging technologies. So I'm always itching to kind of play with whatever is new. I focused my design career on physical things that had some kind of digital component. So this is a product called, it's a floor cleaning vacuum that I worked on when I was at a firm called Smart Design, and the company is Nito Robotics. I'm going to talk about it a little bit in part of my presentation. And I left Smart Design. I was there as a designer on staff, but as an associate design director, but really wanted to branch out on my own and have always been trying to balance industry and academia. And in industry, it's so satisfying to be able to work on things that wind up in the real world and see these objects with people interacting with them. But in academia, it's also just so incredibly exciting to think about what is the vision of what's emerging and what the future is going to be. So I've always kind of had a foot in both worlds. And as part of my experience in academia, I taught at the Georgia Institute of Technology, which has some amazing robotics research. And when I was there, met a researcher whose name is Andrea Tamaz, who was creating a new lab around a field that was called social robotics that I didn't even know existed as a field, that's all around studying how we interact with machines in a human and intuitive way. So since that time, I've kept working with Dr. Tamaz, her first name is Andrea. And in addition to my work with the lab of actually designing robots like this one that's called Curie that was on the cover of Popular Science a few years ago, I've also just been so excited about sharing what I learn from these amazing researchers with whom I collaborate. And so throughout this time, I've always periodically checked in with what is exciting me and written about it, and have had the opportunity to do an op-ed for the New York Times. Popular Science approached me to do an opinion piece around autonomous vehicles. I've written for The Atlantic. And then when I don't have an opportunity, I also try to create projects for myself that allow me to get my hands on things. Again, you know, this practice that is really about getting my hands dirty with whatever I see as an emerging technology. So a few years ago, I was very excited about the potential for desktop 3D printing to become ubiquitous. And I spoke with a number of experts about what that might mean, and then translated those stories into a children's book that's called Leo the Maker Prints. And throughout the book, there are objects that appear, and there's a URL at the end of the story where kids can download and 3D print the objects. So that was a really fun project for me. In my op-ed for the New York Times, I wrote about robotics and how robotics would start appearing in our everyday objects. We wouldn't think of them as robots, but it is essentially robotic. So we might have a lamp that follows you to wake you up and shine a light in your face. We might have a robotic mirror that can read your weight from a tile in the bathroom and your heart rate. We might have a bicycle that's connected to a jacket that gives you turn signals and gives you directions, a pen that knows what you're writing and sends it to people, the door that greets you, etc. And also this piece I wrote for the Popular Science. And then Glenn already mentioned my leadership of the 4D design program, which if we have time, I'll talk a little bit about at the end. My work, you know, in my teaching in 4D, as well as my writing, has always been about this relationship that we as people have with an object, and also this intersection of what I would call the physical and the digital, and thinking about how we interact with a physical object that might be programmed to behave in a certain way, as well as thinking about how three-dimensional things appear in the virtual world. So for my project at the Dora Maar house, I decided I was really trying to play with this idea of the virtual object. And I was also, I really spent a lot of time. There were wonderful, wonderful books in the house and conversations with Gwen and others about Dora Maar and her practice, and looking at some of the kinds of objects that she was creating, and looking at her piece, Per Ubu, and taking inspiration from that, and also thinking about how some of the emotion with which she lived in the house, and thinking about her being in the house and maybe secluded in the house, and also thinking about how the house sometimes is a place, it's certainly a sanctuary for the artists who are there within it, but what is that relationship to people from the outside? So what I had created here was a projected image of this three-dimensional object that would essentially, we would call it a kind of a camera, this virtual object fantasy camera that I was creating that would have a lens that actually looked at the people outside the window. So their image would actually be reflected in the lens of the camera, and it would appear just as this kind of closed ball in a shell, much like the Pierre Ubu pieces of this wonderful photo, Dora Maar photo of a baby armadillo. And so I was thinking about the shell of the armadillo and the shyness and the relationship with people viewing from the outside of the house. So people would see themselves, and there was a sensor that would watch them. And only if they stayed still to engage with the object long enough would it actually emerge from its shell and open up. And so this is what people would see on a surface that was inside the house. So that's, and then this camera would take their picture. So I was kind of playing with all of those images. So that, is, while it's very different in some ways than my design work, it's also just completely linked through this idea of a relationship between an object and the person, and taking into account all the nuances of that. And so my most recent project that just came out, to hot off the presses, March 30th is the publication date, is called My Robot Gets Me. And it really is a summary of a lot of my work over the last 15 years and where I see those insights applying to everyday objects. And so a lot of what I've had the absolute honor to work on have been these robots. So the very first robot I worked on with Dr. Tamaz was a great experience, because another thing about Andrea is that she always valued the importance of design in the process, where a lot of tech researchers feel like it's all about the engineering and the technology. She really felt that design should take a large role. And so we had a core team that was a mechanical engineer, Dr. Tamaz, who is an expert in social robotics, but also largely artificial intelligence and the software programming that goes on behind it. And we three were the core team deciding on the architecture of this robot and riding this line between it being an appliance and being a thing that you feel comfortable talking to, and a social actor in an interaction. And the idea behind this whole field of social robotics and this project is to think about how we might interact with our computing machines in a way that feels natural, in a way that doesn't require any kind of training or putting in button presses or typing in code. So you just come to the machine with what you know as a human being based on existing as a social person. And so with this particular robot, it would be trained to do a certain number of tasks. So it could learn colors, for example, was one of the exercises. And you simply had to approach the robot, talk to it and say, Simon, take this object, take this. And the robot has pads in its hands, it's got cameras in its eyes, it's got a microphone embedded within the head. And then you say, where does it go? And if the robot doesn't know where it goes, you tell it, and then it learns to parse out the word. You say it goes in the green bin. It learns to parse out that word. And in addition to it taking in cues from you and verbal messages, it also puts out cues. Like if it doesn't understand the sentence that you said, it'll actually say, I don't know. So I have this video that is from the Computer Human Interaction Conference from 2010. And it's very noisy at the conference. The video is a little rough but I have these subtitles. So someone says, Simon, where does this go? And Simon says, it actually speaks and says, I don't know, and does that gesture. And then when the person says it goes in the green bin, then the next time Simon's camera sees pixels that equal that color, it knows that it's green. So here we see, and again, we worked with a company that's been acquired by Google. It's called Mecha Robotics, that did the body of the robot. It's an enormous and complex project, but my focus is purely on what is this human interaction? How do we make the robot look? What aspects of the robot does it need to have in order to be social? So since that time, there have been a number of projects that I've continued to work with Andrea on. One of them was named Polly. And with Simon, we worked on everything from the ground up. Polly came to me as an already kind of finished robot that has this special kind of Kinect camera and this arm, and I wanted to soften it. So I collaborated with a fashion designer, and we developed this robot. And one of the important things for me is having the form of the robot, what we call in design, product design semantics, so that I exaggerate some of the social features. So I exaggerate that it has ears, even though the microphone might not even be in that location. I exaggerate what its field of view is, etc. And following this project, Andrea actually had the opportunity to start a company. So she has started a company that is called Diligent Robotics. It's actually producing a robot for the hospital setting. And the core benefit of this robot is its social abilities. And what it does in the hospital setting is the company did research around nurses and technologists and other workers in the hospital, and they found that nurses are exhausted, they're short-staffed, they're quitting, they're hard to replace, and they're frustrated because they're not getting enough time with the patients, because they're doing things like sitting in a closet assembling kits. And so what Diligent does is gives nurses back time, takes exhaustion away from them by taking on these tasks. There's a lot of running up and down hallways that nurses also do. And so the robot can do that in their place. And so that the nurses, again, have more time with the patients. So everything that we had learned from these laboratory robots that seemed like these really sort of fantastical, isn't it so great to be in lab research because you can do things that don't happen in the real world, actually got to happen in the real world. And as a designer, I always pushed back on the idea of having something be, have extra features or be like a doll, let's say, and really relied on the researchers from Diligent to help me understand what is really actually needed. And there was a lot of need for the social interaction. Because the hospital setting, as we all know, it's a really chaotic environment. It's a really fast-paced environment. It's a really busy and crowded environment. And so if you have a machine that's roving the hallways, it becomes extra important to be able to control that machine as quickly and as intuitively as possible. So there are a few things that come from the field of social robotics that then found their way to this robot. And one of them is around gaze. So being able to, for the robot to understand who is speaking to it at one time, and keeping, so we do have these eyes, which come across as a sort of a cute thing, but they have a function. Shared attention is another principle in social robotics. So if there's a spill, the robot has the ability to spin its head and look at the spill and have a conversation with the person around that. And then there are many other features around, understanding the relationship to the body. Like, do you need to see this robot from a distance? If so, we have this headband that is, a nod to a nurse's hat, but, is really serving the purpose of letting people see the robot from across the hall and getting a quick at a glance if there's an error, what the status is. And I'll show you a quick video of what kinds of things that the robot does. So that's Moxie, and some of the things you see in the video, there are a lot of nuances going on there with how, and to be clear, there is a giant, wonderful team, and they're listed on the Diligent Robotics website of researchers, healthcare workers that give us insight, and certainly software specialists that are programming all of these behaviors. And there is a nuance around understanding if the robot is close to a person, if it's appropriate to acknowledge that person rather than just going down a hallway, the difference between being a certain distance from a person and being too close to that person and needing to say, excuse me, in order to pass. And so all of those things are social interactions and become really critical to the operation of the robot. The robot has since changed from this video, and we actually have a bigger basket for delivering the things it needs to deliver. But it's been getting really great reactions from the nurses. People really love having the robot there. It is really doing its job in helping relieve some of their exhaustion. And also there's a lot that I'm also starting to learn about the benefits of the social interaction. So I took some of the stories from Moxie, and that's an extreme example. But my feeling as a designer was that we could take glimpses of what Moxie does and bring those into everyday products. So even if we have something like a microphone, that microphone doesn't need to have arms and legs and eyes, but it might just have something that makes it feel like it's a head that's spinning around and is pointing towards the person that is speaking to it, or through it, I should say. So I in the book, I also look at research from technologists and anthropologists and others who are studying how we behave around robots and what some of this phenomenon is. So even as recently as finishing the book this summer, I went online to look at Amazon reviews of the Roomba, which arguably is pretty dumb as far as robots go. At least the models that I was looking at are ones that simply bounce off the wall and then they change course and eventually they randomly cover the room. There's not a ton of intelligence in them, yet people perceive them as social entities and people talk to them, people give them names, people feel badly for them if they're stuck under a couch. And so I have some of those quotes in the book. And so, what I start to look at is this critical shift that's been happening in design between having an object that is this kind of container of pre-baked messages, like you might have a microwave oven and you tell it make popcorn and then it beeps to say I made the popcorn, and that's just kind of a script that is a very direct one-to-one relationship between what the person is asking for and what the thing is saying. To we're starting to have what I would call products as entities. Any of us who have talked with what we would call a conversational agent like Alexa or Siri or any of those. Oh, and I forget, I have to be careful to say those. So if anybody is in their homes, I apologize. And Alexa's going, I don't know what to do with that message. Oh, I just did it again. Okay. I sometimes am a guest on a podcast and we call it Madam A. So as not to trigger people's devices. Anyway, the point is we're starting to interact with these devices and they're not scripted in the same way. They actually have teams of writers, and one of them is a person I've interviewed in the book, Jonathan Foster, but it's not the same as this kind of one-to-one pre-baked interaction. It's a free-form social interaction. So I want to think about that, but I also want to really emphasize that not every interaction has to be that conversation where it's literally words or even things on a screen, but that we can get a lot of expression through sound, light, and motion. Even something like an LED or some of the LEDs that I used in the egg project that Gwen was talking about, you can program it to be light or dim. To be at this point, it's very inexpensive to have an LED that's any color in the spectrum, as well as the difference between it flashing or glowing, and all of those things have a message. Just the way this slide shows an exercise that animation students do, where they're asked to take a flour sack and make that flour sack express an emotion, happiness, sadness, nervousness, other social jealousy, confidence, that kind of thing. And so I attribute what we do in product design to being akin to that kind of abstraction. So, you know, again, we have light. I break it down to 3 modalities: light, sound, and movement. And then in the book, I talk about how much goes into the design of a product and all of the things that a product creator needs to keep in mind. And by product creator, I really want everyone who's a team working on a product. So that includes engineers, as well as the marketing folks, as well as the designers for sure. But, you know, having everybody aligned around this goal of understanding that the social interaction should drive all of the decisions. I really argue for that being something that an organization should put front and center for their company. And I'm going to talk through some of these aspects of it. And it's kind of like an onion that builds. So the first thing that's very important that we do think about as designers is what I would call presence. So what is the physical form? And I have an interview. So this is an illustration of the Nest outdoor camera. And I have an interview with the head of design who was leading that project, who wanted it to be, I call it a security camera in this slide, but actually they wanted it to be an all-encompassing camera for the home that you might use to help you greet your friends when they come to the door, or you might use to help you know if your package was arrived, and not to think of it as a security camera. So there, Rocky Jacob, who I interviewed, talked about having most of these cameras have this little shield, and he says it looks a little bit like a police hat. And so he pushed his engineers really hard to develop a camera that wouldn't have that feature. And it really sort of emphasizes that we might just think about the importance of the electronics and everything else just kind of a shell around it, but how important that shell is. And in a project that I worked on that came from a professional drummer, this is a product that's called the Click Brick. And we just actually got the final patent on this, and it's going to be developed and distributed. But what this project was about was, that's Conrad in the background. So he's a professional drummer who tours a lot and works with bands. And he said, you know, the drummer is really the person who sets the rhythm for the whole band. And, you know, the band members will actually even look at the drummer, look at his head, and they sync up with one another. And he said, all of the metronomes that I use are kind of these fussy little boxes with a bunch of buttons. And so I have to get out of my mode of being really social with everyone around me. And I just have to like go into this interface that really doesn't kind of match my stage presence. So can we design something that becomes part of the drum kit and becomes part of my performance? And so what we developed as a team is this device that you strike, and you operate entirely with a drumstick. And so you strike the body of it to start the metronome, you strike it to stop it, you can even tap it to set the rhythm, or you can use your drumstick and roll it along the style on the end of it. But ultimately, the physical presence of this object is one of its most important attributes. So beyond presence, we have what's called expression. And expression is what I started talking about a little bit with sound, light, and movement. This slide is a kid's toy that's a robot that you can program that has this sequence of lights in this one eyeball. And the whole thing is just such a strange physical thing. But when you actually interact with it, it has a ton of expression in just this one eye that has these lights that can either flash or dim, and you know when it's happy or sad. And I worked on what I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, a floor cleaning robot when I was at Smart Design. And one of the things that became really core in my leadership of this project was the sound. And so what I did with the team is we kind of broke down every aspect of what would be most important for interacting with this robot into kind of human sentences. And then I worked with a composer whose name is Scooby Leposki to translate those into a kind of musical composition, being careful to keep things very short so it's not very annoying. You don't want to hear these sounds over and over again. So we have this kind of announcement that cleaning is starting. And this particular robot has a technology that can actually notice if a person's walked in front of it. So it can say, oh, hello. And then if there are errors, we have these shorter sounds that are, let you know that something's wrong because of the tone of them. So that's trapped, that's, that the bin is full. Then we have just these other kind of what we call signature sounds. This is the robot waking up, and then there's a goodbye. And so that's the robot talking to us in what I call this kind of humanese, that again, doesn't need to be literally the kinds of words that we have when we talk to a conversational agent. The next thing is interaction. So interaction is thinking about the object as having senses of its own. So can we have this philosophy around thinking about it being able to see, it being able to hear, it being able to understand touch, and think about all of the ways that this conversation can happen between a person and the product. What's featured here is something called EloQ, that's a personal assistant for people with cognitive disabilities to help them use a tablet without having to dig into a lot of menus. But what I want to show here is something from the more art and performance side of my practice that showcases how those things dovetail to one another. And this thing is called the Lickestra, which is an ice cream orchestra. So a few years ago, I did a residency with a place at School of Visual Arts. It's called the Visible Futures Lab. And one of my collaborators during that time was a woman named Emily Baltz, who is a food designer, and among other things. And she was really focused on food at this particular period of time. And I was really focused on sensors. So we did this whole series of workshops where we put sensors inside of food to see what kind of experiences we could create. And we had marzipan and bananas and peanut butter. And we eventually were super excited about the gestures that people make when they eat ice cream, and the fact that ice cream is one of those few things that you really eat with your tongue as opposed to utensils. And so we really highlighted this. We brought on a composer whose name is Aaron Dyer and had her compose this kind of 4-piece contemporary music around the ice cream. And then we did a series of performances where we actually guided people in and out of the box. And we created these boxes so that they had to eat the ice cream with their mouths as opposed to, picking up the cone with their hands and this kind of thing. So here's just a video of what one of those performances looks like. They're the best volunteers ever. And, that really kind of highlights how art practice and design practice dovetails. Because for me, what I'm using there is called capacitive sensing, and it's akin to what we might use on a mobile device, how you touch the screen and you're breaking an electromagnetic field. But for me to really understand that as a designer, I need to play with it, and I need to so that is another reason that I create certain projects. The next ring in the circle is context. And context is actually one of the most challenging things for our technology and one of the most challenging things for robotics, because we can have a lot of definitions around, the robot sees this, you push this button and the robot does this, but really a social entity is taking in so much information and then using that information. One of the products I talk about is a bicycle navigator that understands that you're on a bike, and it gives you a series of lights to guide you so that you're not actually digging into a phone or a map. And so everything about that product is understands the context of being on a bicycle trip. And in my studio, I created this concept project around this idea of context and not giving people every single piece of information that you could have, because now we have the ability to have an internet connection embedded in our everyday objects, but that doesn't mean that you need to have the stock quotes and your Twitter feed and everything happening through that internet connection. And I talk about the importance of just being sensitive to that particular context. And so this is a coat rack that gives you the current weather, as well as the conditions, as well as the high and low for the day. And what's relevant about that is that you can have this interaction with the object and just make a split-second decision to grab your umbrella and not even really think about that interaction that's taking place, but the object is giving you the information that you need and only what you need at that particular moment in time. And then ultimately what I talk about with this social savvy is intelligence. And it's around understanding so many aspects of the social interaction, including things like privacy. And the project that I like to highlight for this, it's called the Listing Table from the New York Times lab, where a friend of mine named Noah Feehan worked. And what this lab created was a table that people could have a meeting around. And it's got a speaker, it's got a series of microphones. It has a really big switch so that you're very deliberate about turning it on to listen or not turning it on, so you know when it's listening. It will actually record the conversation, and you can tap the table to mark a certain time in the conversation that will then be marked in the transcript. And it also lights up to let people know who in that particular moment it's listening to. And so that's just a really great example for me of a social object. And, you know, I wrap up the book and I talk a lot about some of the ethics around having a social entity that then can become persuasive. And, you know, this is a topic that I'm interested in digging more into in some of my future work is, you know, how do we do that kind of design responsibly when we're actually designing something that is meant to persuade, that is meant to affect us emotionally once we have the social interaction. And then some of the methods that I use involve body storming. So I really insist with a client on having them think about again, all of the things I just talked about, the context, the way the thing expresses itself, what information is it taking in. And in order to understand that, it sounds very absurd and it sounds like what you would do in kindergarten, but we have people literally act out the part of the person. We use cardboard to create a mock environment. If it's, you know, the pharmacist's office, for example, with the hospital robot, and then have somebody acts out the part of the robot. So in this example, this is from a conference called Design and Emotion that I ran a workshop in a few years ago. I literally had we did a scenario around an oven. And could someone act the part of the oven and say, you know, your food, the timer that you set isn't quite enough. Your food could be browned a little more. Your party guests are not here yet, which I can see on your calendar, et cetera, et cetera. And then I take some of that information and bring it into storyboard scenarios that are very similar to what you might see in prepping for a movie, but it's actually meant to be a document that the entire team can refer back to in order to understand, again, how important the social interaction is for every decision that's made around a product. And then there are a lot of other methods. One is called Wizard of Oz. This is a video that is from the Stanford Center for Design Research, where my colleague, Dr. Wendy Ju, who's now at Cornell Tech, and helped me a ton on this book project. And it's around envisioning what a robotic ottoman might be like. And what she and her team was doing was they actually are controlling this with a remote control. And there's somebody behind a screen that the research participants can't see, but it allows them to have a lot of expression through the object that is also very sensitive to the context and everything about the context, including the person's state of mind, including their gestures, et cetera. And doing an object this way allows you to understand what needs to happen without necessarily needing to program it all ahead of time. So that's really a great example of the goal of social robotics, is this kind of interaction. And, you know, again, like, it's an ottoman, it's not a robot the way we think of a robot, but this is what the whole book is really about. And so I want to give us time for questions. I wanted to mention, I bring all of this, and I have a number of students who are working on these kinds of principles to a program. It's a 2-year master's program that is at the Cranbrook Academy of Art, which is where I'm sitting right now. If any of you come through Michigan, the suburban Detroit area, I'd love for you to come visit us. We have a delightful museum that is currently hosting our students in their degree show. We also have an Institute of Science that's part of our larger campus. And so I'm particularly excited for this 4D program to be blending science and art and to have some collaborations happen there. We are in person this year with a lot of protocols. In the fall, we did a lot of meetings outdoors. Most of our work is studio-based and critique-based. So the students are in their studios. When we do a critique, we do it via Zoom, the way we're doing this meeting right now. When we're in our hallways, we wear masks. Everyone is at least at a 6-foot distance. We've been making it work, weird as it is. Do a lot of stuff outdoors. This is from one of our seminar sessions. And this is from a student named Michael Candy, who was in Australia for this year because he wasn't able to travel, but he's going to be joining us again. And he works a lot with these light-based robots that you can see from this video. And these are just some of kind of his projects. And then that's just where you can learn more about the program. I do Instagram at Carla Diana. Gwen can also share my contact info, but again, I wanted to make sure to leave time for everything else taking place, the conversation, Q&A, etc. So I'm going to stop the sharing.
Right. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them down in the question and chat area. Thank you so much, Carla. Thank you. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
I wanted you to tell the story about how you programmed the wall in your son's room, the light.
Oh, yeah.
Really
yeah.
Interesting how, anyway.
Yeah, so the one, I showed this slide, but I showed it very briefly, of these tiles that are these triangular tiles, and they're made by a company called Nanoleaf that I interviewed for the book. And I had been using their product for a number of years. And so there are a series of these triangular tiles that you can link together, and you can use it as and make it into a lighted surface on the wall, and they glow really beautifully. They're really exquisitely engineered, and you have an app and you can program them. And so when my son was 1 year old, you know, there's a whole business of sleep and kids. Anybody who has kids, like, would just like, I'll just leave it at that and say, because sleep. And what I figured out is I could, and he was in a room that didn't get great natural light. So he wasn't getting a lot of those cues. And so what I did is I programmed the lights so that they have a pattern where they glow orange with this like wonderful kind of animated pattern at 7 a.m. which was the time that I wanted him to understand was the time to wake up. Anybody who has kids knows that there's a bit of training that happens, like they wake up in the middle of the night or they wake up at other times. And it really was a lovely way for me and my son to communicate about this shared understanding of 7 a.m. without ever having to teach not ever. I mean, eventually he's learned the clock, but at one, it's not appropriate to talk about the clock. But it was totally appropriate to have this shared experience of the light and have that be a mutual understanding of the time to wake up.
And he really integrated that, right? I mean, even that's interesting.
Yeah,
I mean, to me, that's a good example of the kind of almost this sort of seamless design with interaction with design and how
and I would go into the room and he would be like holding his arms up, even at the time before he even had language, he would just go like, oh, it's the time, as I'm awake, it's the time to wake up. And he'd go, yes, you're right.
And so in a way I felt like from what I was reading in your book was that it's a little bit about finding this kind of intelligence in the design, or kind of emotional intelligence, I should say, in the social design. Because I was trying to figure out exactly what is social design, but to me, it's like this. Is that right?
Yeah.
Is that a good way to say it?
Yes, I think that is a great way to say it. Yeah.
And I was wondering, as a designer and an artist over time, has your understanding of that really evolved? What is emotional intelligence, and how to integrate that into? My question makes sense?
Yes. No, it has. No, and it really sort of touches on that ring of the framework that I call context, right? Because it really for me highlighted how sophisticated our social interactions are. How much goes into one of the examples I talk about in the book is if you have an Amazon Echo, one of those little speakers, I talk about privacy and how it does one thing in a really lovely way, which it has this light and it lets you know who it's listening to at that particular moment in time. But it also just does this thing where it kind of like sits there. You don't know when it's listening, when it's on or it's off. And so, as a designer, thinking about that metaphorically as if it were a person, and if you were to walk into a room and have a person just kind of sitting in the corner and not greeting you and not letting you know that it was there, that would be very odd. And so really thinking, it's trying to, I guess it's about dissecting what we do socially as humans and how much we take for granted in all of those interactions, right? Like, even if you were at a party and you wanted to speak with someone, and thinking about everything that goes into, well, that person's already talking to someone. It looks like they're wrapping up the conversation. I'm going to try to get eye contact, and I'm going to stand a little bit closer. Oh, like maybe they're not wrapping up the conversation. Oh, maybe the host is tired and we should actually be leaving the party. Like, all of that conversation is going on in our heads, right? And that's exactly the kind of thing. And I've just become more aware of that and more aware of how complex that is.
Right. In fact, so we have a question, which is one of the sort of the darker side and the questions of sort of the ethics of it, from Afric, who's a former fellow as well here. She says, thank you. Would be interested to hear you expand on ethical issues of design, especially in relation to humanoid features and robots interacting with kids, etc., illusions and deceptions. And I think there is, like, we have this idea about robots, about the sort of dystopian future when they take over the world, which is an anxiety. And what you brought up about trust, like, is something listening to us? Can we trust those objects? What are they?
Yeah. And it's a really intense topic that, like I said, I wrap it up in the book, but I'm looking forward to kind of delving deeper into, because there's a lot there, and it's something that I explore a lot with my co-host in the RoboPsych podcast, which was created by my co-host, whose name is Dr. Tom Goriello, who is a PhD psychologist, and so we issues. I think that, first of all, as a designer, I'm not a huge fan of the replicating of humans. And I think that I think it's an exercise in hubris, frankly. And I think that it's also a lot of what we do as designers and creators of objects gets hugely influenced by science fiction. And we've seen so many science fiction visions of these humanoid robots, starting with Metropolis, going all the way to like Ex Machina and iRobot and all of these films, and we kind of think that robots need to have this human form, when it's I mean, engineering wise, well, anyway, there's so unnecessary for so many reasons. But I think that the potential to deceive is really great. So I really advocate for designers having a sense of ethics, thinking about ethics, talking about ethics within an organization, understanding what the goal is for a product in terms of the social interaction, understanding if there is an attempt to give us habits that we don't agree with around, buying products we don't need, that can harm us, and this kind of thing. So I think there's just all of that. And then around the question around humanoid and humanness, a really interesting case study to look at is Google very recently, in the last year or two, had released a product that they call Google Duplex. And it is a voice agent that can make calls on your behalf. And so you can just tell it to make the appointment with the hair salon, and supposedly it will do this call for you. And they did an on-stage demo of calling the hair salon and going like, I'd like an appointment at noon. Can you maybe? And the whole voice is just this simulated, not just simulated voice, but simulated messages, right? Like this thing that I talk about, product as entity. And there was a huge backlash around it, and a lot of conversation around it, and a lot of people feeling that it was unethical, and feeling that it was like there was an intent to deceive. And so I think that it was really great to watch that, and to see and to hear that conversation, and to take part, at least in our podcast, in that conversation, because I think since then there's been a lot more conversations among people who are working on these kind of products of being more transparent and being upfront, and actually, and having a voice like that announced ahead of time, like, yes, you're getting a call from a robotic voice, right? Having, and one of the things I do in the book is I mentioned Microsoft's conversational agent is called Cortana. And he talks quite a lot about wanting to craft it so that it's clear that it's not a robot. And I think it's tricky. That agent sounds like a human. It's a lot of ways modeled around a human. There's a team of screenwriters that work on the script for that entity, as well as like that happens behind the scenes for all of them. And so it's pretty intense, and I think it's a pretty new and open field. And I think it really involves psychologists and sociologists and screenwriters and people thinking about and making decisions around ethics to be transparent.
Right. The one last thing I wanted to just talk about really briefly and ask you about, because I think I heard you speak about this, is that the way it is now with all of our smart objects, is that they're all like talking to us and blinking and sending alarms, and there's a feeling like it's just making life so complicated.
Oh yeah.
Instead of more simple, like just you get a new phone and you're like, I can't figure this one out, and then the alarm and the micro. I don't know. We're being bombarded with all of this devices. Instead of them streamlining our lives, it's almost the reverse.
Yeah.
Hectic feeling to it all. And I feel like in the design world, that's not at all your style. Like there's more this, this idea of, I wonder if it's because it's early days and that there will be like some kind of smoothing out, or if it's just going to get
Right. Yeah. I mean, I hear you, right? It's kind of a cacophony. I mean, it happens to me sometimes. Like this thing rang and this thing, and like, oh, like stop. Look. I mean,
or like, was that your phone or mine? The ding,
Right. Like, I turned it off, but now it just buzzed. Like this sort of like if everything's expressing itself, right? It starts like stop expressing yourself already. And I think that so some of it comes from the subtlety of what I talk about around context, but there's another ring that I actually didn't cover in the talk that's called ecosystems, that is around the products actually being able to talk with one another. That is, a particularly difficult challenge for designers and engineers and product creators. And, and there's a lot going on there. Like brands are have an ideal vision of this. Like, I mean, a lot of us have experienced some of the Apple products, work together. And when they work together, it's really delightful. And I think that there is, and it's, like you mentioned early days, like I do think there's kind of an awkward teenage years around this. And this particular thing is something that designers know to work on. As complex as it is, but then there are a lot of kind of political business challenges around that, because every company has their ecosystem and they may be able to manage their ecosystem, but people don't necessarily purchase, like I have a Samsung TV and then I have this, Apple computer and I have an Amazon Echo, and each of them have like a closed system. So I do know that the manufacturers are trying to have a consortium where they can maybe come to some agreement around the what is called, the engineers are calling the protocol around the way these things communicate with one another, so that there can at least be like some attempt at harmony. But that's not the way that brands originally envisioned them. They originally envisioned that like, oh, you have a Samsung TV and then you have a Samsung headset, and
it's kind of like
huge
with
problem.
Duplex, then you. Sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I think I finished.
No, I'm just saying it's like Apple with their new plugs every product. So you're like kind of like, stuck in this. You have to,
Yeah.
I don't want to end on that note at all. Is there any other questions? I haven't seen one pop up. Sometimes I miss them. So I really appreciated the book. I haven't finished the whole thing, but I was able to read some of it, and I love your style, and it's really easy to read and anecdotal and fun.
Oh, good.
And so congratulations. I know writing a book is a big job.
Yes, you would know.
And I also just wanted to say that along with being a designer and being a professor, you're also an artist, and that part of your practice, I look forward to seeing the fun things that you play with and make in the future.
Thank you.
So thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us. And this will be recorded. It is being recorded and will be on our website. And I'll send the information about how to get the book and how to, send a message to Carla if you want to. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.